Alright guys, welcome back to the video. So in this one we're going to be building a nice, fairly simple nightstand. Now I did take some time to design some interesting details into this one, so it's not the simplest version or as simple as my previous nightstands, but overall I think it's going to be a pretty cool project. Especially when we get to the end and you guys get to see what I do with the drawer fronts here. But anyway, what's special about this project is the materials that I'm using mostly. So you can see here that I'm working with red oak. Now red oak is probably the single most hated wood within the woodworking community. Probably a little bit more than even pine or poplar. And for the longest time, I just always followed into the belief. I followed that crowd mentality of red oak is just the worst wood out there. Until I decided that I was going to try some red oak on this project, because what ended up happening is when I went to the lumberyard to pick up ash like I would have normally used, they were completely out and they told me they probably wouldn't get any more 8-quarter stock for at least a month or two. So I just decided let's go with some 8-quarter red oak and just see what I can do. And what I found when working on this project is that I think red oak is probably my new favorite wood when it comes to a wood that I want to stain. Because there's a few key characteristics about it that actually make it a genuinely good wood to work with, especially when compared to something like ash. The main thing is the fact that red oak is a heartwood. When you're working with this wood, you're working with the heartwood of the log, which makes it a lot easier. You're a lot less prone to tear out. You don't have to worry about those crazy grain direction changes in that you have to worry about with ash. Overall, it's just a really nice wood to work with, and I was genuinely surprised when I started working with it. The other thing that I found very interesting about red oak is the Rayflex. Now, this is going to make a lot of people angry, but I absolutely hate quarter sawn white oak because of the Rayflex. I think the Rayflex and quarter sawn white oak are always, they're just too big and blotchy looking. I've never liked the look of it. But when you get the Rayflex in the red oak, there are these nice subtle details that don't take up a whole lot of space, and I think they look very interesting. And so because I'm working with these strips of this 8-quarter stock to make this nightstand, I ended up with all these little Rayflex everywhere, and even after the staining process, all those little Rayflex still show through, and I think they bring in the perfect amount of detail. So if you ever thought about working with red oak, I highly recommend it. For one, it's probably the cheapest nice hardwood on the market, and two, it actually is a surprisingly good wood to work with. So don't get stuck in the woodworking community's hatred of this wood. It's actually a pretty good wood to work with, but that's all I'm going to talk about for this video. Anyway, back to the design itself. What we're doing here is what I like to call the hollow post leg design. So basically we're creating this L shape with a bevel along the long grain edge. We glue that together and that's what creates our structure. What I like about this is it's very similar to a post legs. It has the same look, it has a lot of the same structural stability, but the benefit is that it's a little bit easier to work with because you're starting with just those smaller individual pieces, and then when you glue it together, you actually end up with that open space in the inside. So if you're having to fit up shelves or anything like that, it makes it a lot easier because you don't have to cut around a post leg. Now what I will say is the only real difference between this and a post leg in what I do with my furniture design is that if I want a surface to have a flatter look to it, so I want the stretchers to be more in line, then I'm always going to build my legs like this. If I want to have a little bit more depth and have my legs sticking out more, then I'll go with a post leg, so using a full 1.5 by 1.5 piece of wood. So either way, they're kind of interchangeable in my design process, but there's definitely some times where I like this look versus the actual post leg look. Now for the joinery, we're going to be using pin, mortise, and tenon. And if you've watched any of my other videos talking about stained pieces of furniture, this has kind of become my go-to form of joinery because it just works flawlessly. I can dry assemble this piece as many times as I need to, and just by simply sliding those pins in, it locks up my joinery together so I can get a good idea of fit-ups of other pieces and that. It allows me to basically build this entire piece of furniture without a single drop of glue, and then the very last step after all my staining and that, I throw the pins in, put all the little bit of glue in, and we're good to go. We've got a nice solid piece of furniture. Also nice that during the glue up, I don't have to use any clamps whatsoever, and you can see just how well those pins pull the pieces together. And of course, another one of my current obsessions is just adding curves to everything. I love the look of curves in furniture. I think it just helps lighten up the overall structure a little bit. One of the things I am hoping to try and figure out in the future here is how to do cloud lifts, which are just slightly different than a curve, but have kind of the same effect. Now the downside of cloud lifts is that they do take a lot more technical skill than a curve, and I don't get to use my fancy little compass plane. But overall, I think they'd be something else I would like to try and add in the future. But anyway, because I had so many of these curves to try and do, I decided to try using my router to help clean them up and get them a little bit more similar to each other. Because when you're dealing with curves, especially when you're dealing with side panels and all that kind of stuff, matching into those curves, the more similar those curves are, the easier your job is down the road. By taking that time to make that first one absolutely perfect using my compass plane, I could then use a templating bit in my router to match all of the curves perfectly to one another, and it just gave me this nice consistent curvature throughout all of my different pieces. And your eyes do not deceive you here, this is a piece of 8-quarter walnut. So I decided recently that I am absolutely sick of not being able to work with walnut. I really love walnut, it's probably one of my favorite woods just for its natural colors and all that, and I've really wanted to work with it, but the problem is that walnut is expensive. This piece that I'm working from here was about 7 feet tall, about 11.5 inches wide, and I paid almost $250 for it. I think maybe even a little bit more than that. I don't quite remember. But it's a very, very expensive wood. But after the recent project that I did, that narrow cabinet, I realized a very good trick to working with an expensive wood, and that is veneering. And that was kind of my whole plan with this project until it totally fell through and I decided to just work with the solid wood as it is. So what I'm doing instead is just taking all of these strips of this 8-quarter walnut, turning them on their sides to give me that nice quarter sawn grain, and gluing them back into panels. So what we're working on right now is the 2 side panels, the floating panel for the shelf, and the floating panel for the tabletop. So that's what we're gluing up right here. Now this technique where you take 8-quarter stock and flip it on its side, I found that this works the best with walnut. It works pretty good with cherry. You can't really use it with woods like white oak or red oak because of those Rayflex in it. But when it comes to a wood like walnut, this is my absolute favorite way to use it. Even if it's a little bit more efficient because there is a lot of milling involved, you do have some wasted material, I think the look of that beautiful straight grain is just so much more enjoyable than the flat sawn stuff. Now we will be introducing some flat sawn grain into this project in a little bit here, but for now, these panels, I just really love the way they looked at that perfectly quarter sawn grain. I think it just worked so nicely with the overall look of the project. And because I was working with these slightly more expensive walnut panels, I decided to just keep my side panels as simple as possible. I didn't want to try and match a raised profile or anything to them because just by adding in that raised profile, that pretty much doubles the price of these side panels. So I decided to just keep it nice and simple with these 1/4-inch side panels, and I think it worked out really good. It's not as dramatic as a lot of the other stuff I've done, but it was also not super expensive, which is kind of an important part right now. And I think this is one of those really interesting points to talk about when it comes to furniture design, is kind of learning where you can save a buck and where it's important to kind of not try to save money. So in the case of these side panels, because this is a nightstand, the side panels are rarely going to be seen. One side is always going to be up against a bed, and the other one is probably just not going to get seen very often. So it's not as important that they're this super decorative panel that they have all this visual interest to them. So by going with something that was a little bit easier to make, it not only saved me time in the shop, but also the cost of materials. And that's one of those things that I definitely have to learn this myself on my own furniture, is where I can kind of make those changes to help save a buck. And that's one of those things that I've been learning a lot lately as I've been trying to do more cost-effective projects, is I've been figuring out these little areas where it's like, okay, well, rather than making this thickness, I can save a little bit of material and make it this thickness. Or rather than making this thing this length, I can save a little bit and change that up. But it's also important to not compromise your design based on being cheap, because that is definitely something that I've seen a few woodworkers run into. You want to make sure that you're not changing up your design. You want to make sure that you're not doing things in the wrong way just because you can't quite afford it at that point in time. So this is everything from the quality of hardware that you use to the types of wood that you use, whatever it may be, right? You don't want to do things in a cheap or poor fashion that's going to end up backfiring in the future just because at this point in time you couldn't quite afford to do it the right way. My recommendation, if you're in that circumstance, is it's always better to save up your money for a little while longer so you can do the project the right way rather than just trying to get it done in the cheapest way. And I know that sounds like I'm preaching, but I think it's important when anytime I talk about doing a piece of furniture where I'm trying to save some money, I'm trying to do things in a cheaper way, I think it's important to mention too that I'm also not compromising the quality of the piece of furniture, because that's the most important thing to me. At the end of the day, I don't want to waste my time building a piece of furniture that's not up to my own standards. So even though I'm doing this project with these cheaper materials, the quality of the piece is still just as good as anything else I've built. Onto the staining process. This is the same steps that I've used in a lot of my recent projects, where I start with the general finishes dye stain to give that good base color, and then I come back in with a gel stain to help give a little bit more of a pure, richer color. And what I found really interesting about this with the red oak is that there is actually a slight difference between it and ash. The ash definitely takes the color a little bit more consistently. You definitely get a little bit more of a pure dark brown color, whereas with the red oak, you end up with a lot more natural color changes and textures in that. Especially with those Rayflex in there, they do change up just a little bit. So I'm really excited to continue working with red oak because I do think that it is just a little bit more visually interesting than ash is when you stain it, and I do think it looks just a little bit better. But with those natural differences, for the pins, I decided to use ash because I wanted to take advantage of that slightly purer color that you can get from that stained look. So I'm taking the time to make each of these pins individual on the lathe. This is a super tedious process, but it's worked out super well for me every single time now, so I'm probably going to keep doing it. And then it's just a nice simple process of making this little setup block, and that lets me get my pins down to the perfect length every single time so they're all matched with each other. Then to get that perfectly black look that I was going for, I decided I was just going to soak these things in that black dye stain for about 20 minutes. And this actually worked out amazingly. We got this absolutely pure black look on every single pin. They didn't look as bad as they did on the last project where I kind of had some messing around with them. These ones were pitch black and they looked absolutely perfect. And this is definitely the way I'll be doing this in the future. Then for the finish, I'm using my homemade mixture of tung oil, beeswax, and carnauba wax, and I have to say, hands down, this is my favorite finish I've ever worked with. For years, I've been using the tried and true oils, and I think that that's a good quality finish, but this homemade stuff that I'd made is just, it's better. It's just all around a better finish. It gives me a nice surface feel, it looks really good in the end, and overall, I just really like the fact that I made it. Now for the glue up, I actually find this very funny because I don't get stressed out about doing my glue ups anymore. They're really just a simple part of the project. Like, I know it's a kind of a cliche thing, especially here on YouTube, where you get a lot of woodworkers who, you get to the point and it becomes this super dramatic thing where like we're doing the glue up and everything could go wrong and oh no. But now I find that the glue up is just kind of part of the project because I spent all of those earlier parts of the project really working on my joinery, making sure that everything is aligned properly. Everything just kind of works when you go to do the glue up, right? As soon as I put that hide glue in the mortise, I spread it around a little bit, I put my piece in, I hammer in that dowel, everything just kind of comes together. There's not really any stressor. I already know that everything is going to work before I ever put glue on anything. So if you're someone that really worries about doing glue ups, that they stress you out, try working with some of this more traditional joinery because it does make the overall project just that much easier. You do have to worry about alignment and all that kind of stuff early on in the project, but at that point in time, you do have a lot of ability to make corrections and fixes as needed. And this is one of the best things about learning to stain wood is not the fact that I could make wood look the way that I wanted it to look. It was more about this fact that I kind of forced myself to learn these more traditional joinery techniques that actually made the overall project just a little bit easier. Then for the drawers, we're going to be using a piece of wood that I absolutely despise. Now this is a piece of quarter sawn fir, and I bought this a couple of years ago, and honestly I cannot believe how much I paid for this. If I remember correctly, I think it was about $9 a board foot, and this was back when I was only paying about $10 a board foot for 8/4 walnut. So it was ridiculously expensive, and I still have no idea why I decided to buy it, but I just thought it was kind of interesting, because fir being a softwood, I just thought it was going to be interesting. So I've had this piece of wood sitting in my shop for years now, never knew what to do with it because as soon as I cut into it, I realized that it is kind of an ugly looking wood. It's very, very orange in its natural state, and it just doesn't look very good. So I decided to use it for the drawers here just purely because it was that quarter sawn grain, and I could make my full width drawer boxes out of a single piece. And so I thought that quarter sawn grain would go nicely with the quarter sawn walnut that we have for the side panels. And overall, I can say I'm actually very happy with the way that they look. It doesn't look bad. I still think that the drawers do look very, very orange, but I also don't think it looks particularly bad because the drawers are closed 99% of the time. And when you do pull them out, you do have that really nice quarter sawn grain, so that does look pretty good. Now, one thing you'll notice when I'm gluing up these box joints is that I'm not going to be using any clamps because on a recent project, I'll call it a recent failed project, I tried to use box joints to make this cabinet. And what ended up happening is when I went and did the glue up, something got out of square, something shifted when I wasn't looking, and the cabinet became completely useless to work in. So when I was doing these box joints, I decided to just use this technique where I'm using the blue tape on the corners to help pull everything together because these box joints don't need a ton of pressure to help hold them together. together. And same thing, the hide glue doesn't need to be under intense pressure. So by just doing everything without clamps, it just made life a little bit easier. I could kind of wedge things into alignment, and I didn't have to worry about excess pressure being applied to the joint, anything like that. It just made it a little bit easier. But remember before how I said that this piece of fir was my most hated piece of wood in the shop, and this is also exactly why. Fir is an absolute nightmare to hand plane, because on most woods, if you need to go against the grain, all you need to do is just put a high angle blade into your hand plane, keep it razor sharp, and you shouldn't have any issue. I tried doing that with this fir and it just was not having it. If I hand planed anywhere against the grain, it tore out like crazy. So there was a lot of sanding involved. It was very annoying. I managed to get everything fit up nicely, but yeah, it was not an enjoyable wood to work with. I wouldn't choose to work with fir ever again. There's a lot of other woods out there. I would even take pine over fir any day of the week. So yeah, it's one of those things, if you ever have the opportunity to buy fir, kindly run the other direction, because it is not a nice wood to work with. But again, they looked fine, they're done, and I just hope that I never have to work with fir again, because it's just a horrible wood. Now for these drawers, we're going to be using solid wood drawer slides, because this allows me to kind of work around those L-shaped legs that we built before. And I'm also making sure to make the actual slides themselves out of fir, because if you were to use a hardwood in this circumstance, that could end up doing undue wear and tear on the drawers, and it could end up causing damage there. So just by making sure that the slides themselves and the drawers are made out of the same material, it just makes sure they're not going to cause excessive wear and tear on each other. They might wear out over time, but then it'll be pretty easy to just replace those drawer slides when they need to be replaced. And I really wish I could have shown a better footage of how I fit up these drawers, because they came together amazingly. I was able to actually fit up those loose slides, so I was able to get a nice parallel fit between the two drawer slides, and this went just perfectly together. But it was so hard to kind of get the camera in and get any footage of what I was doing, so you guys will kind of have to deal with what I got here. But overall, I was super happy with these, and this kind of is a traditional style of doing drawer slides. I think it's going to become a little bit more standard practice for me, because it just works amazingly well, because you can get a really nice fit. If you do it right, your drawers slide even better than I would say than ball bearing drawer slides. And this is where the project gets interesting. So for the drawer fronts, I decided that I wanted to do something with a veneered piece of plywood just to try it out. And so the ideas kind of started spiraling from there, because at first I was just going to do nice, simple, straight grain, horizontally oriented grain across the drawer fronts. Kind of the idea, the way that you would imagine a drawer front to look. But then I got thinking, well, if I'm using plywood, this actually opens up a whole new possibility. I can make some vertically oriented grain, so that would look pretty cool. And then I remembered that I had this beautiful piece of figured walnut that's been sitting in my shop for a long time now, and I just haven't had a good idea of what to do with it. So all these things kind of came together, and I started working on this kind of overly complex glue up. Now in hindsight, what I'm doing here with all these different plywood and walnut pieces that I'm putting together and slowly assembling this kind of complex panel, this was totally overkill. All you really need to do is take a piece of plywood, put some edge banding around it when it's all said and done, and it would look just fine. What I was trying to do here was avoid edge banding, and I realized that that's just kind of part of working with plywood, and it's also way easier. But overall, this was just a really good learning opportunity. I was able to get everything dialed in just perfectly, and it came out looking amazing. And one of the important parts here is the fact that I had this curve in the top drawer. I really had to take my time to figure out how to get that curve and when to put that curve in so that I didn't screw anything up. Now, I can't stress this enough. This is what you guys are watching here is the epitome of overthinking a situation. I definitely overthought about what I was doing here, having to make this whole complex plywood glue up. It was way more complicated than it needed to be, and I'm really looking forward to, in the future, not having to deal with this much annoyingness when trying to make this style of drawer fronts. Because this is a style that I want to use all the time now. I think it looks super cool. I don't want to overuse it, but yeah, I think when you get to the final piece, I think you guys are going to like it. But anyway, this is one of the fun things about learning woodworking is in the beginning stages, you're going to do stuff like this where you realize afterwards that there was a way easier way to do something, way more efficient way, whatever. But that's the fun part of learning, because the first time you do something, you just got to figure out how to get it done. And it's just a matter of figuring that out and just making something that works. And then from there, you can actually enhance and improve your processes. And this is how I've learned everything in woodworking. It's all started from let's do things in the most complicated way as possible. In fact, my very first woodworking project, I tried to make a picture frame, and to cut the rabbit on the back of the picture frame, I tried to use a Dremel because I knew nothing about woodworking. I knew absolutely nothing, and I had a Dremel sitting in the garage, and I just thought that was a tool that I could use to do that. And, you know, in hindsight, obviously that's not the right way to do things whatsoever. But just by picking up that tool and trying to do something that I wanted to do, it's now set me off on this whole career path of hopefully being a professional woodworker someday. And it all comes down to that ridiculousness of trying to cut a rabbit with a Dremel. So yeah, that's one of those things. I highly recommend, if you've ever thought about trying a certain technique or what that in woodworking, just go for it, right? You don't always have to do things the perfect or the right way. It's better to just kind of get it done and get that experience in there. And that's the same thing when it comes to applying these veneers. This is something that I'm still fairly new to. I don't fully kind of understand the process. There's still a lot of stuff I have to learn how to do better. But overall, even what I was able to do just on this project, I think is absolutely mind-numbingly cool. I was absolutely speechless when I saw it all come together, and I think you guys are going to enjoy it when you see it in its final form. But it's one of those things where this is just the first few stages of this process. Eventually, you know, I'm hoping in a few years that once I've actually learned how to do this a lot better, I can make stuff that is just insanely cool. But for now, we got to start at those beginning stages. So if you guys have enjoyed the video so far, I would really appreciate it if you could hit that like button and subscribe to see more of the videos that are going to come out. I've got a whole roster of videos coming out very soon, and that I hope you guys will enjoy. But anyway, one of the most challenging parts of these drawer fronts is cutting them into their individual sections, because if I remove too much material, we can very quickly end up with losing this nice continuous grain that we've got running across all the drawer fronts. But if I don't remove enough, we can end up with things not fitting properly. So it was very challenging. There was a lot of math involved and just a lot of patience mainly to just make nice clean cuts and just try to get things as accurately as possible. And this is one of those times where just patience managed to pay off. I dialed things in perfectly, and I made sure to account for the edge banding that I wanted to put on afterwards. So all I did was take the number that my drawer front was supposed to be, minus a 1/16 of an inch for the edge banding that I was going to be putting on, and it just kind of worked out flawlessly. So I don't know if it was dumb luck, beginner's luck, anything like that, but I'm just so happy that it managed to work out. I did end up losing the book match just a little bit, just ever so slightly. Because of all the sanding that I ended up having to do, you can see when I was using that flush trim bit, it made a pretty good groove around the edges. So I ended up having to do a lot of sanding in order to get that out, and I lost the book match just ever so slightly. So it's not quite perfect, but I think it still looks very, very good. And again, it's all about, this is just the fact that it's the first time that I'm doing this. I think it'll just continue to improve from now on. And one of the things that I definitely have to do very soon here is the next time I'm at the lumberyard, I gotta try and find more figured walnut, because this stuff just looks amazing, and this is kind of the perfect situation where I would love to try and use more figured wood. Because in most cases, in the furniture that I build, I don't actually like using highly figured wood because I just don't know if it goes very well. But by using this figured walnut for these drawer fronts, this stuff just pops and it brings so much attention to those drawer fronts, which is exactly where I kind of want people to be looking. So I'm going to be able to appreciate this figured walnut for the rest of my life, as this is going to be my nightstand for a long time, I hope. And I hope whoever has this nightstand after me will appreciate just the beautiful natural grain there. And so this is just about the best part. You can see how these drawer fronts all start to come together. So as always, guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.